Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Well, we're here to, as the video montage shows, to see the Call of Duty. Call of Duty, the funeral directors and cemetery response to Titanic disaster and the valuable lessons learned today. Our host today is Todd Van Beck. He's a North American renowned funeral director, service historian. He hails from the farmlands of Iowa. He's educated in Boston and has been a funeral director for 44 years. He's the author of many articles, has written several books, and has lectured and taught across the globe. He has just returned from a nationwide tour of New Zealand. Todd is a friend to many funeral directors and cemeterians in British Columbia. He's traveled throughout Canada for the last 25 years. Todd is a graduate of Mount St. Mary's Seminary, Boston University, and the New England Institute of Mortuary Science in Boston. Everyone, welcome to Todd Van Beck.
My interest in this subject was piqued some years back when I became friends with a man named John Snow from Halifax. And in the course of our conversations, John just offhandedly mentioned that his firm had headed up the funeral director's response to the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. And I was immediately smitten with this subject because it hadn't even dawned on me that after all the movies and all the Broadway plays, that the funeral directors from the maritime provinces of Canada, when I began to investigate this story, what unfolded was just this tremendous output of human compassion and just plain hard work. But you see, I'd already figured out that funeral directors have that kind of in their DNA. Because I had done work on the Coconut Grove fire in Boston in 1942, same story. The Aragoy Theater fire in Chicago in 1903, same story of funeral directors stepping up to the plate to have care, compassion, and concern in the most distasteful and treacherous of experiences. And so today, in a brief time that we've been given, I want to walk through this event with you. And also you've been given a handout which documents specifically the funeral director's response to this tragedy of actually 100 years ago today, on April 21st, the Mackie Bennett was sent out and arrived at the debris site of the sinking of the Titanic when all of the work of the embalming began. But let's push through this pretty quickly because we want to talk a little bit about the unbridled arrogance of the early 19th century. They really believed that the Industrial Revolution had solved most every problem, and particularly mechanical problems. However, the Titanic was having problems almost from the beginning. The Titanic was built by the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, and it was commissioned by the White Star Line out of Liverpool, England, and they had three gigantic ships that were built: the Titanic, the Britannic, and the Olympic. Now, all three ships ultimately sank, all right? Not like Titanic did. The Olympic and the Britannic were sunk in the First World War. On May 31st, though, when they were pushing the Titanic out into the harbor, right off the bat, on May 31st, James Dobson is killed because he slips under the Titanic as it goes out into the ocean. It was not billed originally, and it really never was billed as being unsinkable, right? But it was billed as absolutely the safest way to travel the North Atlantic line, and the history of the Titanic is it is an issue of human fault and arrogance. The Titanic was built in 10 frantic months. At the end, it weighed 46,329 tons. It was the largest floating object ever built on the face of the earth. On April 10th, 1912, it started its voyage. And there was a who's who on the Titanic, plus the poor and the wretched of the world. There were a bunch of Canadian millionaires. There were Allison's Hayeses, the Baxters of Montreal. There was the Fortunes from Winnipeg. But yet on the poor third class, there was the Ox and the Brons that were from Sweden and going to Saskatoon. There were the Asplunds that were from Norway and were headed for Edmonton. There was Velta Heineken from Norway and Ole Olsen from Norway, who were headed to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Early on Thursday, April 11th, 1912, the Titanic stopped for its final stop at Queenstown, Ireland. Shortly after 2 p.m. it embarked with 2,228 passengers and crew aboard. And of that 2,228 passengers, 1,523 would never make it to the shore to New York City. The captain of the Titanic was a man named Edward J. Smith. This was to be his retirement voyage after 40 plus years at sea. Smith would never have to answer for any of the things that happened at the Titanic. For 12 hours, between on the 14th of April, for 12 hours, he received numerous iceberg warnings from all ships on the ship line on the North Atlantic. Captain Smith could have altered course. He could have slowed down. The first warnings that he received came in at 9 o'clock a.m. on the 14th of April, and the last came in at 9:44 p.m. on April 14th, 2 hours before the crash. This was his final voyage after a tremendous sea career, and Captain Smith today is seen in Titanic history as a person who was caught up in the industrial arrogance of the age. In fact, we know that he sped up on the orders of a man named J. Bruce Ismay, who was the head of the White Star Line, to make a record of traveling from Europe to New York City. The map, the Titanic, started at Southampton, then it went to Queenstown. It was headed for New York, but it also was going to end up a tremendous connection with the port of Halifax. And the Titanic sank about 375 miles south of Newfoundland. All right, and so the port of Halifax immediately became this epicenter of activity. Now, of course, Halifax Harbor is noted as the finest, the deepest, and it's always been known as the safest harbor in the world. The trip for the Titanic was absolutely uneventful. Nothing happened. But the crow's nest and the people in the crow's nest, a man named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Owen, never saw the North Atlantic calmer. Now, as we move into this story, we'll see that calm seas worked against Titanic. The crash was simply that they ran into an iceberg. The truth of the matter is that now the history is pretty clear. If they had hit the iceberg head on, it wouldn't have sank. But they went to the left, and as they came around the iceberg, everyone knows that icebergs are 10 times larger underwater, it started to rip out the side panelings of the hull of the Titanic. At 11:40 p.m., it struck. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to sink, which is interesting. James Cameron's movie on the Titanic outlasts the actual sinking by 30 minutes. All right. Now, in my work in Nova Scotia, I had the good fortune of doing some disaster management training for the RCMP. And in this disaster management, I've done some things with FEMA over the years in the States, but in Nova Scotia with the RCMP, it was a very interesting thing because Halifax and Nova Scotia constantly was having these disasters. 5 years after the sinking of the Titanic, the Emo and the Mont Blanc collided in Halifax Harbor and had an explosion that was 6 times atomic bombs. And so if we look at Halifax, and then the Swiss air crash in our own time, Swiss Air 111 went down at Peggy's Cove, and 100,000 body parts were retrieved, and the Dominion of Canada in the corner in Halifax had to sort through all of that. In disaster management, here's what we know. Disaster management almost has a religious connotation to it. It sounds strange, but it's true. Let's say, for instance, right now, and this is just how it was on the Titanic, this is ordinary reality. You folks are here, and let's see, let's take a straw poll here. Maybe some of you wanted to be here, right? Maybe some of you are here under duress because somebody paid for you to come here, all right? Maybe the province is leaning on you because you haven't had your hours up to date for the last 20 years. You know, who knows what motivation has brought you all here? Some of you may be interested in this subject. Some of you may be just absolutely disinterested in this subject. Who knows? It's called ordinary reality. However, if the ceiling dropped in and this hotel collapsed, which it easily could, other buildings have collapsed, so we cannot live in the meaningless idea that we're immune from all of it. I can tell you the ones that survive this thing would be thrust into what is called the finite meaning of reality. And the finite meaning of reality is when everything slows down, where all of a sudden you are looking at something that is totally fearful, but you're totally attracted to it at the same time. When I was in seminary, the finite meaning of reality was connotated to a divine experience. And all through the testimonies of the people that survived the Titanic, they spoke about divine experiences that night, watching, literally happening, what was told to the world could not possibly happen. So the ship hit at 11:40, and on the ship, there's heroes and villains, as with any disaster. First of all, when the Titanic sank, the White Star Line denied that it had sank. The newspaper reports went out that the railroads were sending passenger trains to Halifax to pick up the passengers that were due in, because they knew that the ship had had trouble, but they did not know, they denied that it sank, so the ship was going to limp into Halifax, and the trains were being sent there instead of up to New York to pick up the immigrants and to pick up the rich and the famous. On the Titanic was some heroes, and one is this man, Wallace Hartley. Now, the old apocryphal story is that at the end, his band were playing Nearer My God to Thee. That is probably not true. In fact, interestingly enough, most of the reports said that the last song anybody heard the Titanic band playing was Alexander's Ragtime Band. It was designed to keep spirits up. Now, the entire band vanished in the sinking of the Titanic. However, Wallace Hartley becomes this hero, and this is a photograph of his monument in England. I've put a blue arrow right by the actual monument, and his funeral, which is a shot up to your right, was a national event, and it was so important when Wallace Hartley's body was found, because of what he symbolized, was that the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Herbert Asquith, showed up for this musician's funeral, which was utterly unheard of in the snooty late 19th century, early 20th century British caste system. And we're going to talk about the British and American caste system as we go through this. Now, we're going to come up to the Marconi story in a little bit, but the distress signal in maritime work in 1912 was called the CQD. And when the Titanic hit, and when Captain Smith was finally convinced by the ship's architect that this ship is going to sink, and Captain Smith said, "This ship cannot sink." And the architect said, "Sir, it is made of cast iron. I assure you this can sink." And the first distress signal was sent out was the CQD. Now, there's some iffy things, of course, in any disaster that goes on. But one of the iffy things was 4 miles away was a ship called the Californian. And I'm going to just plant that seed now, all right, because the Californian could see the Titanic. All right, now I'm going to leave that in your mind because we're going to come back to that in a little bit. The CQD was being received, but now Captain Smith said, let us send the new international distress signal. And the first time SOS was used in human history was when the Titanic sent it out. And the person, interestingly, I hope you find this stuff interesting, the person that received the first SOS was a man named General David Sarnoff, whose photograph is to your left. And David Sarnoff received the SOS from the Titanic. He was in New York City, and David Sarnoff eventually took his Marconi radio set and turned it into the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, in New York City. Now, here's another thing. The April 15th curse. The Titanic sank on April 15th. In April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and died. And for me, April 15th, 2002 was tax day in the United States. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the funeral home, let's rephrase it, the undertaker was John Snow. The firm was established in 1883. It was clearly the largest funeral home in the Maritimes. By 10 a.m. on the 15th of April, though, the world knew about, and particularly in Halifax, everybody knew that the Titanic was now at the bottom of the North Atlantic. And the White Star Line contacted the Snows to orchestrate the disaster response to care for the dead that they knew the Titanic disaster was going to create. This is the John Snow Funeral Home today. It's still there. And it's called the Five Fishermen Seafood Restaurant. And I've dined there many, many times. And trust me, the Five Fishermen Restaurant are not paying me as a spokesperson. But if you get to Halifax and you do not go and have their halibut in Halifax, you have missed one of God's great delights, right? Now, his sons, all right, Will Snow and his other son, John Snow Jr., asked for the assistance. You know, sometimes we get it in our heads that one firm takes care of all this. That's not true. Didn't happen in New York City. Didn't happen at the Marriott Supper Club collapse in Kansas City. Didn't happen at the Cove Grove fire. One firm tends to lead the charge, but John Snow and his sons sent out and asked for the assistance of every undertaker in the Maritime provinces. And by April 16th, the next day, which is mostly where our story is going to go from here, is more than 60 funeral directors and embalmers and undertakers from New Brunswick, Newfoundland, from all the Maritime provinces were on their way to Halifax. Also on the 16th, the cable ship Mackie Bennett was chosen to go back out to the debris field to search for recovery efforts, etc. Now, this is an actual photograph of the Snow undertakers with the coffins that were stacked up out on the streets that were getting ready to be taken down to the Halifax harbor to be put on the Mackie Bennett. John Snow and Son ordered 10 tons of ice, which was put in the hull of the Mackie Bennett. Each embalmer that was on their way to Halifax was instructed to bring their own embalmer's grip and their own instruments. And we're going to see some slides in a minute where this is exactly what happened. The White Star Line was going to pay for all the coffins and all the embalming chemical and all of the ice that was going to be used. Cooling boards were brought in from every funeral home in Nova Scotia, and 100 plain coffins then were put on the Mackie Bennett. Now, across the world, the leaders begin to speak out. William Howard Taft, the President of the United States, was the President. Robert Laird Borden, whose picture's in the middle, was the Prime Minister of Canada, and Herbert Asquith was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Now, they all are deploring the issue that there were not enough lifeboats on the Titanic. And this is absolutely true. You all probably know this story. The maritime funeral directors, though, responded in force. And these are some photographs of the different undertaking companies from the Maritimes that responded to this. Some of you won't recognize these buildings, but for instance, down here in the corner right here is the Brennan's Funeral Home in St. John, where John Doyle worked for years before he retired. The maritime funeral directors sent in a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Walsh, and she was one of the first licensed funeral directors and embalmers in the Nova Scotia, and she was there to embalm women and children. Now, her husband was also an embalmer, but he was in Boston. He was a noted actor, interestingly. Some of these stories are very, very fascinating. He was in Boston on the theater, and so she went, and her job was to embalm women and children. Interestingly, only one child, and we're going to talk about that child at the end of this program, was recovered from the North Atlantic. There was a man named William Wallace who was there, and he was the son of a chap named Fenwick Wallace, who published the first funeral trade magazine in Canada. There was a man named Thaddeus Stevens who was there, and he actually lived up until the 1980s, and he was the last embalmer, we thought and think, worked on the Titanic disaster. This is the Mackie Bennett, which is a cable ship. It was contracted by the White Star Line at $550 US a day to go out on the recovery. John Snow Jr. joined the voyage, and on April 20th, it left Halifax Harbor because reports were coming in from scores of ocean liners that were crossing that North Atlantic Channel that they saw wreckage. On April 21st, 100 years ago today, 51 bodies were recovered from the North Atlantic. Tomorrow, 100 years ago, 26 bodies were recovered, and 3 days from today, 100 years ago, 128 bodies were recovered, and John Snow reported bodies were stacked everywhere on the Mackie Bennett. All right, now let's talk about state-of-the-art communication. The Marconi was the radio, kind of an ancient ham radio, for want of a better word, and it was the way the Titanic communicated with land. However, all through the day, and this is what I want to talk to you about a little bit, all through the day, the Titanic was not seen just as an ocean liner. Today it would be seen like a cruise ship. Everybody was having fun up on first class, of course. And so all through the day, these ridiculous Marconi messages were being shot out from Titanic's Marconi Center. And the telegraph, the Marconi operators, were absolutely wearing out on this stuff. As a matter of fact, the Californian received so many bogus messages, goofy messages. Does that sound like email to you? Worthless messages that mean absolutely nothing. And they were just coming out by the scores, and on the Californian, the captain of the Californian had it. And he instructed his Marconi operators to shut it down, even though they could see this ship, and we're going to get back into that in a little bit. So it wasn't just the issue that the Californian was, what would we say, uncaring. The Californian had it with all of these bogus messages coming out. All right, now, this is a photograph of Will Snow embalming a body. Isn't that a great name? Will Snow. Think about it a little bit, will you? All right. Now, this seminar is mentioned about lessons that we can learn. Now, yesterday I talked about some lessons about funeral service that I've learned over the years. But I wanted to go some original sources on this, and so I'm going to let the funeral directors of 1912 speak for themselves. If you look at the blue arrow, there's Will Snow's embalmer's grip. And if you look real closely, you can see blood bottles there. You can see fluid bottles. You can see his instrument tray that many of us, I've got my boss's old embalmer's grip. It's a treasured item in my life. But let me read to you what Will Snow wrote to his sister Agnes in Halifax. Here it is. Here's a lesson for 2012, speaking to us from a funeral director that has been dead for many, many years. Here's what Will Snow writes. Dear sister, how we have worked so earnestly and reverently. All the work was done with great care. Our embalmers, what courageous lads they are, yet no one will probably ever know what we have encountered out here. It is hard and straining on the mind and on the body. There was awful evidence of the fierce struggle for life, hands clutching wildly to clothing, faces distorted with terror. But it is no use to describe what we saw. As I said, ours is a noble but silent calling. On the deck of the Mackie Bennett, Snow's developed this system. Now, you heard your coroner speak today, and he spoke with great eloquence, I've been told, and all the forensic sciences that we have, the crime scene shows on television, people are addicted to it. Well, such was not the case in 1912, let me assure you. This is how they identified bodies. Each body got a number stenciled on a canvas, and that number was put in a logbook, and they tried to make an inventory of their valuables, what they were carrying on them. The key to this inventory, though, this is going to sound a little jaded, but it's the truth, was not identification of every body. It was identification of first-class passengers. The word from White Star was, if you can identify, so when you see what ends up happening here, 59 of the people get shipped out from Halifax because they've been identified. The president of the Grand Trunk Railway in Canada was identified. John Jacob Astor was identified. Isidore Straus, the owner of Macy's department store in New York City, was identified. But Ole Olson, that was headed to Saskatoon, was not identified. You see what I'm getting at? All right, so there was first class, second class, and there was steerage. Embalming went on night and day. Embalming went on any level surface. All right? They had to order more coffins. This is a photograph of John Snow Jr. And while they are now out there, they're sending back messages to Halifax. We're running out of coffins. We're running out of canvas. We're running out of ice. And we're running out of embalming fluid. So as we see now, you're going to see that another ship is getting ready. The Minia is getting ready to be sent out. This is a photograph of John Snow and Cecil Zink from Dartmouth. Zink's funeral home now is Manitel. And so that name rings a bell for a lot of us here. And this is Cecil Zink and John Snow making stencils. They're putting numbers on their canvases. Now, the reality of this was that many of the bodies had to be buried at sea. However, there was the Right Reverend Canon Hind from the Anglican Church in Halifax who went out on the ship, and the crew of the Mackie Bennett was required to attend all the burial at sea services. But if the bodies were too mangled, too distorted, too decomposed, but the decomposition, I have to say, was not necessarily a problem, because the North Atlantic was frigid water. And so the temperature of the water, while it killed everybody, basically, that got off the ship and didn't go down with the ship, it was a preservative, just as we would see cool temperatures today. Now, on April 26th, the Minia is sent out, and 11 more bodies are sent. Now, I want to share with you one more letter. This is the Minia. Another letter that Will Snow writes to his sister. Here's what he writes. We have been sent out by the White Star again. But it does not look promising. We are now just hunting for bodies. Halifax will soon be nothing but a gigantic undertaker's establishment. On April 27th, the next day, Will Snow writes to his sister again. Dear sister, it was blowing a gale and foggy, but we stuck to it. Bodies are now all scattered, and never did we come on two together. We recovered for sure the body of Mr. Haynes, who's the president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. Father says the railroads are being uncooperative, and he is fighting them on transportation charges for back home. Oh, dear sister, grief and greed, it's never good. The Mackie Bennett arrives on April 30th to Halifax Harbor, and all the hearses from the maritime provinces are there. This from Citadel Hill. The bell and the guns begin to blast that the ship is on its way in. However, photography is prohibited at the docks, except one of the officers on the Mackie Bennett shot this photograph of the hearses lined up with coffins lined up in a row on the harbor, waiting for their movement to the Mayflower curling rink. All right, as we get into this, you'll see the Mayflower is the place that is used for the identification and continued embalming. The Mayflower curling rink is still standing in Halifax. It was the largest open building that they had. And so right here is the length of the building, and here you can see hearses lined up, and they're taking bodies in, and here are families waiting to go in, because here's the deal. There was no photography, there were no dental records, there was no fingerprinting, there was no nothing. There was one way to identify a body, and that was for the bodies to be laid out in coffins lined up and canvases pulled back, and families would walk down and look at all these bodies in an attempt to identify their dead. Such stress and such trauma was this process of identifying that the Snow Funeral Home had on hand a registered nurse by the name of Nellie Remby on standby in case anyone collapsed. The Titanic is a story of hopes and dreams. You have millionaires, you have princes and paupers, and you have widows and orphans. However, on the Titanic, you had a lesson that lasted for a while called the democracy of death. That in the end, the governments of both the United States and Canada and Great Britain began to look at this constant steerage obsession of first class, second class, the issue of not enough lifeboats, even though the lifeboats were up to code. And they finally said, somebody said, the code isn't enough. And so from the Titanic, as from every disaster, comes these hard-learned human lessons about common sense and safety and compassion for other individuals. Even the President of the United States was not immune from grief, because William Howard Taft, whose photograph you see here with the top hat on, had his chief advisor in the White House, General Archibald Butt, who is in the uniform there, he sank down with the Titanic. Money meant nothing. They found millionaires with thousands of dollars wrapped around their belts, bobbing up and down in the Titanic. They saw money floating all over the Titanic, and John Snow said that nobody dipped in the water to grab a dollar bill. But they did dip in the water to retrieve a body. John Jacob Astor was renowned at that time as one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He went down with the Titanic. His funeral was held in New York. As a matter of fact, Snows would show me the embalming table in Halifax when they were still downtown on Argyle Street that they used, they said, to embalm John Jacob Astor's body. But the sad thing, which is a lesson for us all about the sacredness of human life, is that the real tragedy of John Jacob Astor's life was that he had just gotten married. And he had married a woman 30 years younger than he was. John Jacob Astor had no children. And when she got in the lifeboat, and survived and escaped the sinking of the Titanic. 5 months later, the baby was born. She was pregnant when the Titanic hit the iceberg. This is Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Straus. They own the Macy's department store in New York City. And Mrs. Straus was right at the edge of the Titanic, and she was getting into a lifeboat. She turned around and she said these prophetic words that has gone down in history. She said, "We've lived together many years. Where you go, I go." They found his body. They did not ever find Mrs. Straus's body. On the day of April 2nd, Thursday, the embalmers had prepared 59 bodies for burial. Most of them, though, were still unidentified. And the burial was to be held at Fair Lawn Cemetery in Halifax. Out of the 1,500 that went down and were killed, 327 were recovered and were shipped somewhere or buried. There were mass burials that went on. In Fairview Cemetery in Halifax, there were 121 burials. At Mount Olivet, there were 19. At the Baron de Hirsch Jewish Cemetery, there were 10. 59 bodies were shipped to different stations in Canada and the United States and back to Great Britain, and 119 were buried at sea. St. George, which is this very unique church, some of you have seen it in Halifax, opened their doors for mass funerals for the unidentified. It's interesting that out of the 2,200 passengers on the Titanic, 1,196 bodies were never discovered. Rabbi Jacob Walter, interestingly, had identified 10 Jewish victims, and they were buried at the Baron de Hirsch Cemetery. On an average in Halifax, for one calendar week, there were between 15 and 20 funerals every day. The last victim, the last survivor of the Titanic just died 3 years ago. Her name was Milavina Dean, and she was 2 months old when the Titanic sank. This is her father, who was going to America to become an agriculturalist, and this is a photograph of her as a child and her brother. And of course, at 2 months old, she had absolutely no recollection of the Titanic. However, by 2009, the last victim of the Titanic had already died. Now we're going to fast forward this to Hollywood. So the question is it going to be Hollywood or Halifax? Right? Because in the Halifax Cemetery, this is very interesting, isn't it, about people? In the Halifax Cemetery, you've got I'll show you a picture of it. There's 3 or 4 rows of Titanic monuments. And there's just a white sign that says Titanic. First time I went to that cemetery, there was nobody there. The grass was green, everything was fine. The last time I went there was after the movie came out. Well, everything was not fine. The city of Halifax had to pave the streets because tour buses were coming in. They had to put pavements down on each side of the gravestones because people had eroded the grass, etc. Now, in the Halifax Cemetery, there is a monument that has J. Dawson on it. And I can tell you this. I'm going to divert here a minute. I was asked to give a series of Sunday school lessons at my church when the Da Vinci Code came out. Right? Because there were people in our church that believed the damn thing was true. They believed that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and Mary Magdalene was buried under the pyramid cone at the Louvre in Paris. And they hired me to give Sunday school lessons trying to teach these people that this was not history, this was, but you get the same thing with the Titanic. That people want to believe that Jack Dawson was a real person. And so when you go to Fairview Lawn Cemetery, Hollywood seems to be prevailing because the most visited grave at the Halifax Cemetery is not the little boy I'm going to be talking to you about. It's J. Dawson because of his connection with sexy Leonardo DiCaprio. All right. Now, it sailed into history. Now, what I want to do end this by reading you an account of one of the last funerals about the lesson that we've learned about our compassion, the nobility of the funeral profession. These men and women stepped up to the plate, and I believe that you and I all possess that historic legacy. I believe we are all charged with this. On Saturday, May 4th, 1912, there was but a simple funeral at Fairview Cemetery. The little blonde-haired boy, the only child found by the Mackie Bennett on the Titanic disaster, remained at the Mayflower Rink, unclaimed and unidentified. John Snow Jr. furnished this little boy's funeral at no cost. The service was held at St. George's Anglican Church. Canon Kenneth O. Hind, who had been present when the little boy was found, now presided. In attendance at this unknown little boy's funeral were 75 officers and crew from the Mackie Bennett, who all chipped in and bought this little one a fitting monument. At the service's end, the little white casket, heaped high with flowers, was borne by 6 sailors from the Mackie Bennett to Snow's funeral coach, where it was conveyed to its final resting place. The stone for the little boy, commissioned by the crew, is still standing in the Fairview Cemetery, and it is larger than any of the others in the Titanic section. On it, the poignant inscription, erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster of the Titanic, April 15th, 1912. What I'd like to do to close this off is I want to do 3 things. I want to read to you an honor roll, the roll call of the funeral directors from the Maritimes of your country that responded to this disaster. And from the letters of Will Snow, we know that they performed with high excellence. Right? They were up against a monumental task for 1912. And folks, it would have been a monumental task for 2012. I'd like to read this list off to you. I'm going to leave the podium. I'd like to ask us for a moment of silence, not just in memory of what happened 100 years ago, but also in memory of the nobility of the funeral directors that were our ancestors in this great profession. And then you folks can decide when you want to take your break. I'll leave you at it. I just want to have some quietness as this program ends, if you don't mind, with your permission. Here's the who's who in the funeral services response to the Titanic disaster, April, May, and June of 1912. From Nova Scotia, John R. Snow Sr., John R. Snow Jr., W.H. Snow, H.H. Davis, Bertram Cruikshank, A.W. Murray, Ned Borden, C.P. Olive, F.W. Brown, Samuel West, Cecil Zink, F.D. Meisner, Russell Hinchy, Jacob Sweeney, Frank Newell, A.K. Van Horn, J.F. Wright, George McLaren, W.S. Campbell, H.T. Stephen, George Simpson, Lyle McGinnon, E.C. McClellan, John Logan, Frederick Roop, A.J. Woodman, and Neil Beaton. From New Brunswick, George A. Chamberlain, N.L. Brennan, Mrs. Mary Walsh, Patrick Fitzpatrick, Fenwick W. Wallace, William H. Wallace, Abram A. Tuttle, Fred, Oddie, and Harry Tuttle, A.B. Lauder, Michael Arthur Mayer, William Campbell, Thaddeus Stevens. From Prince Edward Island, Dudley Wright, Ben McCarran, and George F. Thorne. May their memories guide us in this great profession of the work that they so nobly accomplished.